As a fan, I join you in enjoying a conversation with the Memoir's terrific editor, Christopher Richards, the marvelous Hilton Als, and the splendid Kim Hastreiter.
Thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to Kim and Hilton for being here. So, Kim, I wanted to start with you. You knew Bill.
I did.
For 4 decades, is that right?
Yeah, 1977, I guess that's when I met him. I first moved to New York.
And how did you two meet?
Well, I was going to be an artist, and I moved to New York to be an artist.
Where are you from, Kim?
I'm from Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And
over there.
Yeah.
Over there.
But I went to a million art schools. I went to Cal Arts, you know that school?
Mm-hmm.
I studied with John Baldessari. I came to New York to be an artist, to be in a gallery, to be in the Whitney Biennial. You know, I was very ambitious to make art. But I got here and I was kind of like, oh, I have to get a job because I didn't have money. And
that makes sense.
And I moved across country. This is good, with Joey Arias, who I met in LA. And we drove across country in a pickup truck that was mine with a dragon painted on the side. And
what was Joey wearing?
Joey, I don't even remember. But he was my friend I met in LA. He helped move me out of my apartment in LA, and we came here. So Joey and I got an apartment on Houston Street, and he got a job at Fiorucci, and I got a job at this clothing store on Madison Avenue called Betsy Bunchinini, and I did windows there, and I just needed to pay my rent. And this store used to hire artists, and so then I kept coming up to, I had to take the subway because I lived on Prince Street. I would take the subway and get off at 60th Street and walk to Madison and 64th every day. And you know, this guy would be like on the street every day. This is like 1977. And he would be taking pictures. It was Bill, but I didn't know who he was. And because I was kind of crazy looking in those days, I would also stay out all night and go to these clubs, and I would be wearing like punk-like clothes and crazy. I looked crazy. And so I worked on Madison Avenue, and there's not a lot of crazier in those days on Madison Avenue. So Bill would be like going apeshit when he saw me. And so we just started talking, and every day. And then that weekend, I saw him in the flea market on Canal Street. There used to be a flea market there. And I was like, what are you doing here? He said, oh, every weekend I come because there's such great style here in the flea market. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. Here's the guy from 64th Street, and he's in the flea market on the weekends.
So was that weird? Because, I mean, at that point, did people know who Bill was? Was he like a known city character?
But I think that he started his column. He had his little column in the New York Times, but he didn't work for them. And I think he was working for the Soho News.
Soho Weekly News, yeah.
Which was this, but he was just like giving them pictures. He wasn't working there. So anyway, we got to be friends, and he used to take, I had this crazy coat, and he took a picture, and it went in the Times, and he used to take my picture a lot, and then I just started talking to him, and then finally after a year of working there, and I was sick of it, he was like, you shouldn't be working at a store, because I was just selling clothes. And he said, you should get this job at the Soho News where I do pictures. They want me to be the style editor, but I don't want the job. He said, but I think that you should have the job. So I was kind of like, well, it's better than selling clothes. I loved the Soho News. It was this great newspaper that was a weekly, and it had a lot of style, and it was really fun. And so I was like, really? Okay. So he called them up, and he said, you have to hire this person.
That's what I love about those days.
And they were like, who is this person? I went to art school. I was selling. I mean, I didn't have any experience. I knew nothing about journalism or anything, or I wasn't even in the fashion business. I was just an artist who was had his job selling clothes. But he talked them into it, and I went to see them, and it was so like little money. I think that was the reason why they hired me. It was hard. I don't even remember, like $100 a week or $150. It was really little money. And I was like, yeah, I'll take it. And they hired me. So that's how I met Bill. He got me my very first job in the Soho News, which was I was the style editor of this weekly column. And so I brought all my art friends in, and so that was Bill. That's how I met him. He was responsible for my career in a way, yeah.
You said something interesting backstage about his tendency to deflect.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Because, as I said, they wanted to hire him, but he told them, no, you should hire this person. But longer I knew him, he would do that all the time. Like, he would always deflect away from himself. He never liked attention. He never wanted presence. Like, he wouldn't, like, if he went to a party, he would never eat anything. He would never, like, he was like a monk, kind of. He was very self-deprecating, and just never, he would just always deflect away from himself.
So when you two were talking, you were saying you would see him and you would have a conversation. Would he talk about himself much, or was he always
Never.
putting it on you?
No, it was just like, he would just, I don't even know what he even said. He wasn't like a chit-chatter, but he did get into, we talked about politics, and I had a partner, David Hershkovitz, who was my partner, who's kind of like a regular guy, not a fashion person, and ultimately, this job at the Soho News, it went out of business. It was like crazy. And then I started this magazine called Paper in my house. And my art directors, who were my first partners, were art directors at the New York Times magazine. And so we would go to the New York Times, sneak in on the nighttime and on the weekends, and do the entire magazine while everyone went home in the New York Times. Yeah. We paid off the typesetters, and I learned how to typeset in the New York Times, and then we'd have to erase everything. And literally, I hid in closets when Carrie Donovan came in the room. Yeah. But Bill, the magazine was on the same floor as the cafeteria of the New York Times. This used to be on 43rd Street. And Bill would eat all his meals in the cafeteria. He always ate his meals there. And in that cafeteria, they would always also feed the policemen. I don't know if you know that. I don't know if they still do that. But in the New York Times, they would feed all the policemen could eat for free or whatever. It was very cheap or free. So my partner used to, he was like the word guy, and he used to get all the copy and then copy edit in the New York Times cafeteria. And Bill and him used to like hang out together while he was copy editing, and Bill and him would talk politics, because Bill, turns out, was very interested in politics. I didn't know, but he would have this whole other relationship with my partner about politics.
So is it local politics?
Yeah, local. He was very into, like, he hated Giuliani. He was like really like, very left-wing, very opinionated.
He's ahead of his time.
His big thing that he would always say is it's cyclical. So something hideous, like I always think, if he was alive right now, what would he say? He's like, don't worry, it's cyclical. It'll go away. It'll go away. Everything's cyclical. He always said that to me. Yeah.
And he had a lot of advice to you about money, right?
Well, yes. He loved that we were doing this guerrilla style thing. And we started Paper with $1,000 in my house and did it all like bootleg in the middle of the night, and various like companies. We did it in Condé Nast after those art directors left. I have really good stories about how we would go always in the middle of the night, That was crazy. But he would always...
Wasn't the format sort of like a poster?
Yes,
then,
it was
right?
a big poster.
Yeah.
It started as a big poster. But Bill would always be like, he loved that we were doing that. So he would be cheering us on, and he kept the secret that we were there. And he was cheering us on, but he always said, don't ever sell. Don't ever raise money. Don't ever get money. Don't ever sell to the man, whoever the man,
Right.
Don't ever be indebted to anyone. And don't ever print on fancy paper. He always said that to me. Print on the cheapest newsprint, he said, because then you'll be able to have your freedom. So he was always like, that was his big thing. Don't take money. If they offer you money, don't take it. Don't take it. Always hold on to it. He said, you're so free, you can do. And, that's what he would always say.
Yes.
And he would never take a job at the New York Times until the very end of his life, when he started getting sick and he got hit by a car and he needed insurance. And, he would never, ever, ever take a job, sign that paper to get insurance. And that was he was very strict about that.
It seems like that monk-like nature was reflected in his apartment. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like?
I just saw it one
visit?
time. I just saw it one time, and it wasn't really an apartment. I just went. It was like this office room, like a room in Carnegie Hall upstairs that was just filled. I just remember it had tall ceilings, and it was filled with file cabinets. and there was a ladder, and on top of some of the file
Was it
cabinets,
like a pallet?
there was it was like a piece of wood
I went
and like
once,
almost like a
yeah.
yoga mat or some kind of like a
Yes.
tiny little thing that you couldn't even roll over where he would sleep. And there was no bathroom. I mean, the bathrooms were down the hall.
No-
But
and no
I just saw it
no
one
kitchen, I
time
think.
for like 10. I was there for like 5 minutes, and I was like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God.
Was it a shock, or were you
I
sort
was
of
pretty
prepped
shocked
from-
that that's where he lived.
Yeah.
Was it on one of
I
those
think we were picking
occasions
something
of-
up. I don't even remember. It was a long time ago, but I just will never forget it.
It's like one of those occasions when you would go to visit Joseph Astor there, and somehow his door would be open, and he'd say hello or something, and you'd get a glimpse into this kind of monastic thing. And he was not unhappy. He was not an unhappy person.
No, he wasn't. Well, he was. He wasn't. He was like, he loved what he did. He loved it so much. He would, I'd be like, you would be talking to him at an event or something, and he would be asking you a question in the middle of a sentence, and he would see something, and he would literally like shove you out of the way, like climb over you, like as if you didn't exist, and go and shoot someone's shoe or something. He would see, he was so, and I remember someone once saying, oh, it's like a war photographer. Like you can't, you have to get the shot. You can't just wait around. You have to like get it right then.
That's deeply true. He was very attracted to someone during those years that I spent a lot of time with who dressed very beautifully and extravagantly. And so after a while, I just got really annoyed that he didn't take my picture, too. And I asked him.
I'm surprised he didn't.
I asked him, and he looked me up and down at what I was wearing. He said, "You do it on the page," and that's all he would say. So my love was hard-won with Bill Cunningham, but he was not a. One of the, I think, extraordinary things about him as an artist and a person is that he didn't tell untruths. In the fashion business, are you kidding? Like this person who would actually tell you the truth about something or be excited about something that you were excited about that hadn't been commodified, beyond rare. Beyond rare.
What was it like for your friend to be seen by him?
I really don't. I wish I knew more about Bill's romantic life, because what I felt when he connected with this person and a number of other people, like Andre Walker, for instance, you could see a kind of physical excitement that was different than with other people, and I think that eros kind of went into the work. To do that incredible amount of work, you don't have a lot of time to chase people for romance. The romance is really in what you're seeing and what you're recording, I
When
think.
he saw Andre Walker's work, he went
Nuts.
bananas.
Yeah.
And do you think it was about sometimes the person in the clothes, or do you think
Oh,
it was
sure.
the clothes
Well, it could
themselves?
have been a person, but it was also like if he saw great work, he was like,
Yeah.
it was wild.
It was just like a new language. You could see it in the pictures, too, that he would publish. It wasn't really... I think he was more interested in style than anything, so there were less fashion pictures to me than this kind of whatever the new vocabulary was that he hadn't seen before. That was the thing that was the most exciting.
But I've also seen him sit through fashion shows and not take one picture.
At all. The best thing that he used to do was he'd raise the camera and then put it down. That was great.
I remember him a little more in his later phase, like going on 57th and 5th, and you'd see people on the opposite side of the street kind of peacocking their way by. Like they weren't going to work in the neighborhood, they weren't going to shop, they were just trotting along hoping Bill would take the photo.
Yes.
And sometimes just
But he also
Take it
had this
down.
interesting relationship with these really old, like, society ladies. That
Yes.
was like a whole thing that, like, I never knew where that came from, but, like, what's her name? The Astor lady.
Oh, he
Oh, he loved her.
Yeah.
Aggie Gund. He loved Aggie Gund. He loves, like, kind of the society people.
Yes.
I mean, Now that you've read the book, what do you feel like you have more insight into why that would be, or?
Bonwitz, though.
What?
The ladies at Bonwitz that gave him a chance.
I don't really. In fact, I thought the book was going to tell me that he was from a wealthy family, and he wasn't.
No.
So I was surprised. I always thought maybe he's from a really high society, wealthy family, but he wasn't, right?
No. I mean, you think regular middle class,
But
working middle class.
I always, in my
folks.
mind, thought, oh, he knows all these people because of his family, or he's from that kind of family.
Yeah.
But he wasn't.
So Hilton,
Yes.
you know, but one of the things you talk about in your essay sometimes is this idea of the way that Bill would see particularly women and people of color.
Yes.
What do you think that was about for him?
Well, my sense was, not just with my friend, but a number of other people like Andre, for instance, that he was, you have to remember, this is like an era where, here's a story. So I applied for a job at Harper's Bazaar as an assistant. This is 1982 or something. And I was hired by the editor, who then had to call me to tell me that he couldn't hire me, and told other people it was because I was black, that they didn't hire people of color in those editorial positions in fashion. Now, this is something that had been going on for decades. People like Richard Avedon tried to break the color code a lot, and when he would hire models like China Machado, he couldn't say she was a model, he had to say she was an actress or a singer. You had to have a kind of role. And the thing that was extraordinary about Bill was that he didn't ask who you were. He just kind of looked at you and responded. And that counts for a lot when you're a kid or a woman or any kind of person really coming into New York in the late 70s, early 80s. You don't have a tremendous, well, it's like Kim, you know, sort of calling up and saying, I would like this job. You don't have a lot of entrees and a lot of letters of recommendation. And he gave you permission in some way to continue the work that you were doing. I never forgot those issues of details. They would be the entire issue. And he would not get paid for it.
Yeah.
He just
Well,
wanted to
because
be
he
left
didn't
alone.
wanna get paid
That's
for
right. He asked to be left alone.
Right.
And he would do those entire
Like you
issues.
could not edit him, or you could not
That's
touch
right.
anything. or
And more
move a
often than
picture.
not, they were people that you knew from the streets of New York, downtown. The society ladies, I think, were more in the Times, but for details, these were people that you knew and that you saw at places like the Red Bar and Club A, and he was out at all times of the day and night. So,
And in all neighborhoods.
and also and very important, Kim, to recognize that New York was also like a disaster at that point. So people were frightened to go to various areas, and there was never a time that I saw fear on his face. And that, I mean, these things are nonverbal. It's a nonverbal license for you to be yourself, but also to say, I see you and I'm not afraid to see you.
And you're amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
What a powerful thing.
Yeah, really, I found it liberating. Did you, Kim?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember he once did this piece in the Soho News which was just, it was like, I guess, a trend of people ripping their T-shirts, but like millions of rips, like people. But it was really more Latino culture that he found in, I don't know where, Spanish Harlem or something. But they were all
Oh, when they were doing a lot of things in the South Bronx.
But just he went crazy for all of that. You know,
Yes.
he would go and shoot all that, but literally like 1,000 pictures of like all these kids, and they would run. He would run millions of pictures very small. Most
Yes.
photographers like their pictures big, but he would like to run them very small and like
to get as much in.
hundreds of them. Yeah, he would cram them, and he did his own layouts.
Yes. He was a reporter. I mean, one of the things that we shouldn't forget really in the, I don't think he would be very happy with any sort of deification. I think that if we can keep him alive through his work as a reporter, that sort of keeps him current. I remember, this wasn't too long ago, Kim, before he died, and I approached a museum in New York about doing a show of his work, and I'd never heard him. He was never angry at me, and he got angry about the idea of being sort of entombed in any way.
So you went and asked a museum without talking to him before?
I just proposed it,
yeah.
and then I went to him and asked if he would be interested, and he was angry. It was something that made him angry, and it wasn't that he was angry at me. It was just this idea that he would be sort of encapsulated and entombed, that the life of the work wouldn't keep going, his life as a reporter, and nothing is more important to a reporter than to keep going.
So somehow that was going to put a stamp on it, as though
exactly
as though
that
was
it
over.
would that the language would stop. You know, he was the discoverer of new language in clothes, and that meant that the language would stop.
And also, it wasn't. I loved how he didn't just do fashion. I mean, like his Easter parade
that was
pictures were like
amazing.
really always like that was incredible. And then he would do the farmers market, and I got to, you know, like I'm a farmers market person. I live near 14th Street, and you know, he went there every single week, and he would photograph people in the farmers market, or he would love to photograph children, or he'd go to.
It's you know what it is, Kim. It's really he's the founder of street photography.
Yeah, exactly.
And on the street photography, and then The Voice had an amazing column by Amy Arbus on the street, but you knew that The Voice wouldn't have thought about it really had Bill not institutionalized this idea that people were interesting, not the commodification of style or fashion, but people and what they brought to clothes and what they were saying about themselves through clothing.
Yeah,
Would you agree?
definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, having known him for a few decades, I mean, at least you through his work, certainly, and you personally, you know, what sort of changed? I mean, one of the things that keeps coming up when we talk to people about the memoir is that, you know, he's a very unlikely person to have written a memoir to begin with, but that even a lot of his friends didn't know a great deal about his life or his background. I mean, what did you feel surprised by when you read the book?
To me, what I said before, I was really surprised that he wasn't from like this really wealthy family. 'Cause that's what I always imagined in my imagination. I don't know.
I don't.
And just the camp of that book. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I mean, that was like, that was like, has everybody read it? It's really good.
You can buy it.
Yeah.
It's right
it's
out
like,
there.
it's hilarious
right
in a way. It's
outside.
hilarious.
Yeah. I think for me, when you sent me the manuscript, what was familiar and unfamiliar was his treatment by his family at that point. And here's the thing. A lot of queer people have had similar stories, but very few people survive to be cheerful and helpful to other people. And he was not crippled by other people's hatred. I think that's what allowed him to go anywhere.
And
in
his
New York.
enthusiasm. I think if you had to use one word to describe him, it's
Preternatural,
enthusiasm.
yeah.
He was like the most enthusiastic like person you could just see in that book.
Except if you weren't wearing something that he didn't
Right,
find
but-
interesting.
No, but he would then do something to make you look amazing. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? He would
Yeah.
like then turn everything inside out, and he would.
He'd
you let
find
him.
it. He'd find it.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
But
I mean,
a question for you, Mr. Richards.
yes, please.
You've done a lot to bring him to the fore as really a kind of New York figure that none of us wants to forget and that all of us miss. When this book came to your attention, what was your first reaction to it?
Well, it was a bit of a shock. I mean, normally when I hear about a book for the first time, I get a phone call from a literary agent. And when I got the phone call here, and he said Bill Cunningham wrote a memoir, the name was from, I mean, I obviously knew who Bill was, but because I couldn't put the words Bill Cunningham and memoir together, I was sitting there like just sort of puzzled until it landed in my inbox. And, you know, I knew about him certainly from the Times and the documentary, but it was a revelation to me. As soon as, you know, for those of you who haven't read it yet, the first page, Bill talks about his favorite dress as a child, his favorite bit of fashion, and it was his sister's dress. And he says he wore it far more times than she ever did, until his mother beat him black and blue and made him swear never to wear that dress again. And this is the way he brings the reader into who he is and his story. And what a powerful thing for a man who spent his life almost monkishly devoted to style and to beauty, that this early memory was so central to him. So I was tremendously moved, and I didn't know as much about his years writing for Women's Wear Daily, for places like Chicago.
You might know the quote. I should have brought it, but it was a quote in the book that was about fashion late women. That's my favorite quote, about how they're bitch. What was it? It was like the most scathing quote about these women. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you remember
I do.
the quote?
It's like Star-Spangled Bitches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How it's like this incredible quote. I was like, oh my God, like it's so fierce, this quote that he wrote about fashion women, how 70% of them are like horrible and they torture you and he just.
Ooh. Well, here's a version of that. May I? Okay. Did I hear the ladies of the Southampton Beach Club burp? It takes superb posture and carriage, plus exquisite manners and generations of good breeding to carry off high fashion. You can't slip cover a pig and expect it not to grunt. Well, it's not the same formula in high fashion. It's rarely an art, as most people don't have the taste, money, or time. But let's hope the fashion world never stops creating for those few who stimulate the imaginations of creative designers and, on wearing their flights of fancy, bring fashion into a living art. There's only one rule in fashion that you should remember, whether you're a client or a designer. When you feel you know everything and have captured the spirit of today's fashion, that's the very instant to stand everything you've learned upside down and discover new ways in using the old formulas for the spirit of today. Constant change is the breath of fashion. And that's what he resented about me asking him about a museum show.
He didn't want to.
There was no change. It would just be there, and he would have stopped. So when you
What about the movie? When they made the movie of him, he was tortured them. Took them 12 years to make the movie, like 11 years to convince him to do it, and 1 year to make it. I know the guys who made it. They worked in the New York Times. One of them as a picture editor.
was his assistant or something?
His
right?
boyfriend, Richard, and I forget the two.
Yeah.
Richard made the movie, but took him. And after they made it, oh my God, he wouldn't go to. He was upset. He was really mad.
So do you think he ever saw the documentary?
I don't know. He would like us to think that he didn't. He went to the opening at the MoMA, but he stood outside and took pictures of people.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really something. It's like, there's that moment in the film where he's winning the prize in France, like a Legion of Honor or something, and the whole time he's just deflecting, just pointing out to every other guest that they should have won the prize, and then just runs around taking photographs.
But he knew
Yeah.
that he deserved the prize. He knew what he was.
Do you think he took pride in?
Yes.
Yeah. And you were saying
He didn't
earlier,
want anyone to know that, but it made him feel good. I don't think he hated that they made a great movie about him. It was a good movie.
Yes. Were you there when he won the CFDA award?
Yes, and he rode the bicycle on stage. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't. It's one of those really bring your Kleenex moments because he showed up, which was the first
And he rode his
surprising thing.
bicycle
And
on
he
stage.
got his bike, and then he could barely speak because he really sort of knew everybody in the audience. I feel that he had those moments of, I think Kim is right, and I think it's true that he had those extreme, no artist works down, and he always worked up, sort of always was pushing. If you look through those old issues of Details and then his subsequent work in the New York Times, it's really very different. It kept changing because the world kept changing, but what was there was this enthusiasm. That's the bookend for everything. And also a kind of contempt for cynicism. I think that's what he's complaining about at the end here, where it's piggish behavior to think that you have everything.
Well, for him, it was about the work.
Yeah.
And I get that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like he didn't like fakes. He didn't like people who made bad stuff. He didn't
Yes.
like people who were copycats. You know, when he saw originality, he didn't care if it was like in Spanish Harlem with a T-shirt, or if it was on a couture show in Paris, or if it was, you know, it would make him sing. He loved it, you know, and he didn't judge anything. It was all about the work. That's what I think. He really looked at the work, and I've seen him hate on shows. I've seen him be in shows and hate. I share that, you know. I don't really like to see bad stuff either, or copycat stuff.
Yeah.
But when you see something amazing and inspiring, whether it doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be for rich people, just something that's an inspired idea, that's what he lived for that.
He also didn't like the Hamptons.
Really?
I remember.
Not even Southampton?
I ran into him on the Jamaica station and he was just there, and I said, "Oh, Bill," and he says, "Yes, child, I'm going to." He called people child if he liked them.
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, child, I'm going to photograph something," and I said, just to be, I don't know, cute. I said, "Oh, you're going to sleep over?" He's like, "No, child," and ran onto the train.
He used to go to those Rhode Island mansions. Remember
Yes.
what were those mansions?
In the,
Newport. He would
yes.
love Newport.
Yes.
That's why I always thought.
I think it was the thing, even if it was sort of that extreme and
Yeah.
gilded, it was itself.
And he loved
it.
it.
was authentic
He loved
to
that.
itself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It was
he loved like a
authentic to
good,
itself.
amazing wasp look. He
Yes.
loved like a good, amazing b-boy look up in like the South Bronx. He
Yeah.
loved it like as long as it was
The kind of Miss Havisham
Authentic
realness.
to
Yeah,
itself.
authentic. He was
Authentic to
yeah,
itself.
Yeah.
Also, Christopher, were you moved by his real happiness about beauty?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's something about that unfiltered joy. I mean, I found that when I talk to people about my various authors, and I talk about Bill Cunningham, people have a response to Bill that's similar to the response they have to Mr. Rogers. It's just,
Yeah.
it's completely unfiltered love, and it doesn't seem tainted by any kind of doubts or anxieties or scandals or whatnot. But there's a real pureness of spirit. Hilton, would you mind reading that passage about the oval?
I don't mind at all.
There's this amazing passage where Bill is very broke and he's living in terrible circumstances not far from here. I think he's in his early 30s at this point, and he's still working as a hat maker.
And he's a kind of janitor in the building that really is out of Breakfast at Tiffany's. There's like a flood. He's not quite sure who lives on the second floor. Lovers are quarreling. Some people sort of moving out and moving in the middle of the night. And
Stealing
so
things.
Stealing stuff. And so he's trying the best that he can for the rent. And he's living on the top floor, and he's making hats in this building. And he has nothing to eat. So he writes, "One 4th of July weekend, I remember having nothing to eat except a jar of Ovaltine, of which I rationed 3 spoonfuls a day. When I would feel the pangs of hunger, I would go out, looking in store windows, and feed myself on beautiful things. Particularly filling were the windows of decorator Rose Cumming, whose shop was on the corner of 53rd and Madison. I would press my nose flat on the window pane, looking at the most inspiring taste I had ever seen. Everything was different and unusual. I had never seen the likes of her materials, colors, and combinations. And then, in the midst of all this exotic decor, would be Rose Cumming herself, with her purple hair and a tiger-printed dress. I never met the lady until years later, but in those hungry days, her shop would give me the burning desire to run home and create new hats. On weekends, when the men who owned the house on 52nd Street were away, Miss Keene, is one of his employers, would call me as soon as they left, and we would set up a millinery display in the first floor window, removing their business signs. One weekend, things got so desperate, I hung 6 hats on the city lamppost outside the house, and to everyone's surprise, sold several of them to their doctor's wife, who was walking down the street in despair over her sad life. Seeing the hats on the lamppost seemed to give her a ray of sunshine, and she dashed into the house to inquire about them. She always claimed the hats saved her from committing suicide. So he knew the power of it and how it could change your life.
Yeah.
Oh.
You know,
He was a sweetheart.
Yeah.
He really was.
Kim, something you were talking about earlier really spoke to this to me, and I don't know if we can talk about it. It's from the upcoming Antonio Lopez documentary,
Yeah.
And the loyalty to his friend and how kind of integrity mattered to him so much.
There's a movie coming out next week. It's a documentary about the life of Antonio Lopez, who was a wonderful artist. And in it, I think Bill is interviewed, and it's quite not long after he passed away. So it was like his last interview. And he was wonderful. And Antonio Lopez it's a great film. I really love this film. You should all see it. But in this film, he kind of dropped a bombshell that,
Bill.
yes,
Bill?
did you
Bill
see the
did.
film?
You tell.
But it was, can I tell it?
Please.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah. It's
I
just
don't
kind
see
of
why.
like, but it was, Antonio got sick. People were getting AIDS. It was the very beginning. But this movie is kind of really more about like the period before people started getting sick. And what life was like then. And Antonio was really special. But Antonio got sick towards the end of the movie. And he didn't have money. And his partner, Juan, he was desperately broke. And Antonio did illustrations for a lot of designers. He was a wonderful illustrator. And he did, Karl Lagerfeld was very involved with Antonio, and he did a lot of illustrations for a young Karl Lagerfeld, and they made movies together with Jerry Hall and all these like kind of women that Antonio discovered. And so Juan approached Karl Lagerfeld and said, Antonio's sick, and can you, and this is all, Bill is relaying this story, can you hire him to do some illustrations for your collection? He needs money. And Karl Lagerfeld said no. He said, I don't want to hire someone that's going to die or something like that. Really something terrible. And Bill told this story, and he broke down in tears in the interview and said, I never spoke to Karl Lagerfeld again after that. He said it was horrible.
Bravo.
But I was kind of like, oh my God, that's like a bombshell that dropped right before.
And also, I think one of the things about the film, which is really sort of profound, about how people didn't do it for money. It was the art of the thing.
Of which film? This is
The Antonio film.
Yeah.
And Bill being one of those great people, but also Antonio. There's a great
They didn't
photograph
have
of
insurance,
them.
they didn't have money,
anything. There's a great story that Jessica Lange told me about Antonio, and she was living in Paris, and her sister came from your neck of the woods to visit her. And she was reading an article on the plane about this guy, Antonio Lopez, and she came to see her sister, and she said, there's this guy in Paris somewhere, and I think he would be very interested in you. And she's like, sure. And they went out to dinner, and the next day she came home she was studying mime, and she came home, and there was a note on the door, and it said, I've seen you in this neighborhood on the streets of Paris. Please come see me.
And Jessica
Antonio
is a big
Lopez.
part of the movie.
Yes.
She's like stars in this movie.
Yes. Please come see me, Antonio Lopez. And she said it changed everything because then you met Grace Jones, and you were part of this world.
And Bill was part of that world, too.
Yes.
He was very close with Antonio.
Yes.
So this was all part of Bill's world. Very close with Juan.
Yes.
And
it was a world where the thing that was moving to me was that it was a world in which women weren't being exploited. They were collaborators. And so she tells us the story that, Antonio had remade her really, and so she had no eyebrows, and her hair was out to here, 30s hair, and she weighed about 105 pounds, and she then got an audition for King Kong. And she said, I didn't think anyone would be interested. I looked like that. Yeah. And she said, slowly, during the day, they just kept me there. So then the writer came, and then the producer came, and then the director. And it wouldn't have happened without Antonio.
Wow.
So...
But Bill really showed the emotion of love. He loved Antonio,
Yes.
and he was heartbroken when
Yes.
Antonio died. And he told the story. I want to tell a good part of the story because he said that Oscar de la Renta came through so much for him. And that Oscar de la Renta was this wonderful person. And Oscar de la Renta, after Karl Lagerfeld said no, they asked Oscar just hired him for everything, and he did all the illustrations for Oscar, and it so I just want to tell you that Oscar
Yes.
came through.
Yes.
Bit of a silver lining, anyway.
Well, that he was a great person, and
So many people were so afraid
yeah.
to, and fear makes self-protection. You get crippled by self-protection, Anyway, please see that movie because
Yeah, it's a
his
good
soul
movie.
is in it, really.
It's interesting, though, this thing you're talking about with Jessica, how transformative that act of being seen was.
Yes.
I feel like, in part of working on this book, we've talked to some folks who were regular people photographed by Bill over time. And it was almost as though he saw some part of them that they didn't see themselves, that maybe they became more fully themselves. I mean, did you feel any of that kind of hit when he photographed you early on?
I wasn't like one of those people, so it was just really early, and I wasn't. He had his people that he would photograph. I was just more like a fun diversion.
What do you think he was looking for?
Well, Louise Doctor, he loved so much, and he was really close with Louise and Terry Doctor, and she, had this extraordinary style, and
also his
probably Iris Apfel.
Yes.
And
but also
other
the
people
woman
too.
who lived in the building.
Yes.
The photographer.
Edita Sherman, yeah.
That was someone he photographed for
So he loved
decades.
those really eccentric people that were just, wear everything upside down.
Yes. Yes. Just to see things in a new. I think we have to remember not just very important to remember the repertorial, but also what really excites someone who is really sort of looking at culture as it changes. Kim was saying that he said everything was cyclical, and I think that he was amused when things came back, but he never actually photographed trends that were inspired by other decades. He was into the time that he was into.
So what do you think he left for us as a city, as people interested in style, as humans?
Enormous heart, and I think courage and support. Would you say, Kim?
Mm-hmm. And also a wonderful document of the city, what the city was, and the fabric, the diverse fabric that it was made of, and purely from a visual sense. He was a visual person.
Yes, and he celebrated it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the amazing things I found when we were searching for the images to punctuate his words in the book, his archive is just one of the most incredible things I've ever seen, because that, as you were saying earlier, his apartment was these tile, larger
Was it
than
organized?
Very organized.
So he was organized.
Very
Okay,
meticulous.
well, that's good.
That's
Thank
good.
God for that.
Yes.
And incredibly detailed. So he'd have a folder, and he'd have the negatives, and then he'd have the few that he really loved that he had made prints of. If you're dating back to even the pre.
It was like Avedon without a staff.
Yeah.
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 But even like in the, well before the New York Times era, you could see a photo from the 60s of Vreeland, and he would say, exactly what he'd have typed up, exactly what Diana Vreeland had worn on that night,
Wow.
where he was, who the person was on her right and on her left.
Yeah.
But he'd even have this for just downtown parties at venues that haven't necessarily survived to history.
Yeah.
He'd say, boy in a homemade kilt in
Yeah.
tartan, here were the fabrics. And, and there'd be just a few photos out of the roll that he'd pull for making a full print. But what was so fascinating is that, dating back to the 60s, there are 50 years of what people were wearing in New York, what had fascinated him and caught his
He also
eye.
documented drag culture tremendously. Yeah, I mean, he loved a drag queen and documented all the best drag queens.
Yeah, no, he something performative was just
Yeah.
really terrific for him, I think. Hilton, did you have something you wanted to read, or?
I think I'm going to sell some books. So,
Would you like to read a little from the beginning of your intro, or?
sure. Oh, why not? I'm here. I'll read it just a tiny bit. This is really not an introduction. It's more a sort of love letter to Bill. I loved him without knowing how to love him. If you think of love as an activity, a purposeful, shared exchange. You finished? If you think of love as an activity, a purposeful, shared exchange, what could anyone who was lucky enough to be acquainted with Bill Cunningham, the late legendary New York Times on the street and evening hour style reporter, photographer, writer, former milliner, and all-around genial fashion genius, really offer him but oneself? I don't mean the self we reserve for our deepest intimacies, the body and soul that goes into life with another person. No, the Cunningham exchange was based on something else, was profound in a different way, and I think it had to do with what he inspired in you, what you wanted to give him the minute you saw him on the street or in a gilded hall. A certain faith and pride in one's public persona, the face that I faced the world with, baby, as the fugitive star, the Princess Cosmonopolis has it in Tennessee Williams' Sweet Bird of Youth. Like the princess, Bill knew a great deal about surfaces. Unlike the princess, though, he was never fatigued or undone by his search for the most elusive of sartorial quality, style. He wanted to aid Bill in his quest for exceptional surfaces, to be beautifully dressed and interesting for him because of the deep pleasure it gave him to notice something he had never seen before. Even if you were not the happy recipient of his interest like me, the subject of his camera's click, 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 and Bill's glorious toothy smile, there were very few things as pleasurable as watching his heart beat fast. You could see it behind his blue French worker's jacket as he saw another fascinating woman approach, making his day. That's just one of the things Bill Cunningham gave the world, his delight in the possibility of you. And you wanted to pull yourself together to gather together the existential mess and bright spots called your eye the minute you saw Bill's skinny frame bent low near Bergdorf's on 5th Avenue and 57th Street, his spot, capturing a heel or chasing after a hemline, because here was your chance to show love to someone who lived to discover what you had made of yourself. His enthusiasm defined him from the first. Okay, you should buy the book.
There will be books on sale outside, and Hilton will
They
sign.
said, and you will be signing books, yes, Mr. Als? And I said, no one told me that, but I will.
Are we at Q&A time?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to open up to some questions if anyone has any.
Do you know what will happen to the tremendous archive of photos and really fashion history that Bill Cunningham left behind?
I don't know precisely what's going to happen with the archive. I think we'll probably learn news on that pretty soon. And as you can imagine, there are some very interested suitors. This gentleman here.
I'm sorry, George, your remarks. Was there anything actually new and exciting that you read in this undisclosed document that really changed your opinions about him or added the dimension that you hadn't really existed before?
Okay.
To me, it was just reading about him before I knew him, before he was what he was to us. So that's why it was fascinating for me, because no one really knew where he came from or his background or just what he did when he was designing hats. I mean, I'd heard folklore about it. So that was fascinating, because most of the book is when he was really young,
Yeah. Before
he started
got the
taking
camera.
pictures. Yeah.
For me, it really, because he's always been kind of the enigma in the blue jacket in certain respects, I always wondered, how do you become a figure like him? How is your eye shaped in a certain way? How do you work in a world like fashion that's so built on money and luxury and prestige, and arrive at such a democratic point of view that the value comes from a sort of personal expression of self that comes through things?
I think he was just born that way.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that is very interesting and not frustrating about the book is that he sort of just lived his life. And I think
And he
hats
was the boss of his life.
he
He didn't let anybody run it for him.
Once he had those experiences with his family and secrecy about everything, in the book you'll read it, but he starts to slowly engineer a way that is not dramatic at all, but a way to move away from those kinds of strictures. A lot of us, make a big show about leaving home, and he just did it by degrees. The way he did everything, really. It's sort of, no one gets hurt, but he's very fierce about what he knows he wants to do.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with them.
Well, it seems like a lot of things, we talked about that first scene on the very first page earlier, and it seems like a lot of his young adulthood was about losing those inhibitions all over again.
But he mentions so often about his mother being horrified by him.
And
So that's like a theme throughout the book.
And this is interesting because we discovered a sort of title page that he had made. That's where we got the title for Fashion Climbing. It wasn't typed, but it was with the material for the manuscripts, and it was a drawing in his handwriting. It said Fashion Climbing, and as though it was a subtitle, it was the line his mom would always say, which was,
wow.
"What will the neighbors say?"
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I think really,
That's good.
his mom's
That's good
attitude. Yeah. His mom's.
Is there somewhere
atti-
where you could see this? Was this book handwritten? Did he handwrite it?
It wasn't handwritten, but
It was typed?
it was typed, and really meticulously so, because he
Yeah.
was apparently a legendarily terrible typist and a terrible speller.
So you think he typed it or someone else typed it?
I think it's possible that he hired someone.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
I'm dying to know that.
Me
just
too.
to see the notes that he wrote and all that.
But-
I want to know her. Yeah.
yeah.
And there were little notes in the margins. Occasionally, like he would add something. Like there's a bit about thinking about joining the priesthood that he had added in his own
Really?
handwriting.
Yes.
Oh
Yeah,
my
that's
God.
early. It's the
Because he
first.
kind of had a priest essence to him, didn't he?
Yeah.
It was a good priest look.
Yeah. But he also loved a pretty girl.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my
No.
God.
Yeah, but that idea, I don't know. I feel like having just spent some time in Italy with some strong, beautiful Catholicism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I feel like that
Yeah,
kind
definitely.
of love of an ornate beauty, a kind of performative gown that's not foreign to Catholicism.
Yes. Yes.
Any other? The woman in the back. I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm curious if you have any idea around when in Bill's life this was actually written, like whether it was late in his life or if it was something that kind of came together and coalesced as it went along.
Unfortunately, we don't know precisely. As people who have read the book know, the story really ends around the time his hat business closed and he started working as a fashion journalist in earnest, really around the time where he started taking up a camera regularly. So yeah, I would say, anywhere from the 70s to the present. In a way, normally I would say the typewriter would be a hint, but Bill didn't own a computer in order to use one. I don't know that he knew how to use a computer, really.
I love imagining him sort of cross-legged on those filing cabinets typing with 2 fingers.
I'm sure he didn't type it. How much
Yeah.
want to bet he didn't type it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but he would have had
He
to
got one of the kids to do it.
I mean,
Yeah.
having scrutinized his handwriting on the notes, because I wanted to make sure that I got the last sort of revisions in that he had made, it's difficult to read. So I don't know that even he could have turned over his handwriting to somebody else and trusted that they would have gotten across his message.
Isn't it interesting he's left so few traces
I know.
of his actual life?
I know.
The life is in the work and the meticulous recording of things. And then about his process, there's practically no information.
Did he plan for his death? Did he plan a will, or did he plan where his archives would go, or did he?
I can't really speak to that. I believe there was a will, although we don't quote me on it. And so, yeah, I think that there were, but I don't think he had detailed intentions for anything. But I think that was consistent also with who he was.
Because that meant stopping. It
Yeah.
meant stopping. A will means stopping. So that's why there's always a big brouhaha in the paper. Oh, Prince didn't have a will. Aretha didn't have. These people are titans. They were not going to stop. What's death compared to them? So what's death compared to Bill Cunningham?
I mean, he was still out on the street shortly before his final
Yeah.
illness. Before
I saw him at
Before he
the
passed away.
farmer's market
Yeah.
like 2 weeks before he died. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, he didn't envision stopping. We have time for one last question. We
That
this
one.
gentleman in the glasses over here. I don't want to ignore this side completely.
I'm just curious what the biggest challenge in editing.
Sorry.
I'm curious what the biggest challenge in editing the book was, whether you had sort of a hands-off tendency, and also whether in the end he kept himself a mystery.
Well, I think speaking to the first part about editing, it was certainly a hands-off edit. Normally, if I'm working with a living author, I want to be as collaborative as I possibly can, and I want to be sure that they're agreeing to any kind of change that I suggest or something like that. In some cases, if he made a kind of obvious error where it was he picked the wrong word in a certain place, or he had forgotten that he'd repeated the story in a certain paragraph, I would remove that. But it was very, very light. The book reflects very closely the manuscript he left behind after his death. And then the second part was about, I'm sorry, remind me again?
Well, I mean, since he was always deflecting, whether he kept himself to himself even in writing this book.
One thing I find interesting in the critical responses to this book, and we talked about this last week, is that some critics have said we don't learn a lot about Bill's personal life. And I've kind of grappled with that question a bit, whether or not we do or we don't, or this was a lot of disclosure for a man like Bill. And what I've come to believe is that I think this was his
Yeah, I
personal
agree.
life.
I was just going to say that.
I think that
This is it.
this is it.
Yeah.
He went out.
He didn't have like another secret life. Or something.
He
How
looked
would
at
he have the
beauty.
time?
Yeah.
He worked as a designer. He struggled. He went out to balls to see what people were wearing, to fashion shows. There's an amazing scene
He
in
snuck
the book.
in parties.
Yeah, where he sneaks in and he goes up on a catwalk to see Queen Elizabeth from above.
Yeah.
Like this was his life. And
Yeah.
there was an amazing thread that I saw on Twitter from I think somebody who works in style that I didn't remember the name, and I'm kicking myself now, but it was somebody that worked in the style section in Bill's late years, and they'd seen Bill going out on Christmas Eve. It was Christmas Eve, and Bill was going out to take photographs. And the reporter
yeah.
was
Oh, yes.
feeling
Yeah.
very sorry for Bill. He was feeling, he was in his 20s or something, and he was watching Bill go out,
Yeah.
this older gentleman, to take photos on Christmas Eve. And he said to a colleague, like, isn't Bill miserable? Shouldn't we do something? And the colleague who had worked with Bill for years said,
Are you crazy?
Bill, yeah, are you nuts? This is exactly what Bill wants to do right now. He doesn't want to miss people going out dressed in their holiday finery, like going to parties, going to do last minute shopping. This is like Bill lives for this.
Yes.
And I think Bill, while he didn't have the kind of personal life that some other people may expect, I think he loved what he did.
Well, yeah, I never felt sorry for him. I felt sorry for myself compared to him. I mean, to have that much joy always, it's a preternatural, joyful, open person.
Yes.
How rare is that in this world?
I also love that he was such a control freak from after the photography, and like if you spoke to his people who worked with him, his times, he had these little young kids that would like do the layout, and he didn't know how to use a computer, but he'd say like move this over here, and but he was such a control freak about squeezing in as many pictures, and I love that part of it too. And he would love to work with young people, and he always had his favorite, these people, these young kids who would work with him to do the layout, and he always treated them really well, and he would bring them potato chips from the farmer's market.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight.